Your perception is so powerful in dictating your experience of reality. But there's so much to the nature of perception that is unconscious. And so when we talk about making the unconscious conscious, we really talk about leveling up your ability to understand what is happening inside your own mind. And it's unbelievable how much happens inside our heads if you still buy that the construct of reality is held within our skulls. And some of you are branching out away from this, but we have a lot of listeners that are still indoctrinated with the binary reductionist, materialist framework. So we'll just go with that for now. There's so much that goes on under your hood, under my hood, that it's like, sometimes it's like a circus inside. Nod if you agree, please, because I delight myself all the time with the mysteries of my own mind. And I'm like, how did that get there? Where is that go? I thought I worked through this already. What's going on? I'm regressing back to a 2-year-old. Oh my gosh. Well, I have had this wonderful realization to illustrate this point beautifully, very simplistic, through the observation of my little one. Did you know that children have to be taught how to use blankets? If you're a parent, you probably do know this. But if you're not a parent, or if you're a first-time parent and you haven't gotten there yet, you would probably never think about this, because I never thought about it until I was faced with this conundrum. Why the conundrum, you ask? Well, I mean, blankets are awesome. They keep you warm. You get to snuggle up with them, and they're cozy, right? Except apparently, at least my child perceives that they are stuck. In fact, hates any sheet, any blanket of any kind. And I have to wait until my little one goes to sleep. And then I have to sneak on this little sheet that has dinosaurs on it, because at least it'll be fun when my little one wakes up, right? No. So what's happened is that anytime she wakes up and there's a blanket on her, she cries out in frustration, stuck, because she perceives that she is trapped. Isn't that interesting? And if I try to put on any blanket or any sheet while she's going to sleep, even if she's just barely a little bit under, literally we fought yesterday, because as she was going under, she was already asleep, but she wasn't asleep enough. I put the blanket on her and she wakes up and she's forcibly like, no, because her perceptual experience, and this is what I'm so delighted to share with you, because it's such a beautiful illustration. She has an emotional negative experience based on her perception, based on how she perceives her freedom to be ensnared or to be entangled with this thing that is supposed to be a loving gesture, right? A comforting, warm gesture. No, she would rather be cold than be tied up in any sort of mechanism around her legs, around her arms. And it struck me that the relationship to blankets is not something that is intuitive. It's not innate. It's something that has to be learned. And some children don't like them. And what it reminded me of was my own journey. And a lot of people that I work with struggle with this too, which is probably why you're drawn to work with me, because I have literally spent years trying to master this within myself, and I still struggle with it. And it's so frustrating when it happens to be decades into the personal transformation journey, to be hired to help people through this very thing, and then to regress back to being like, I'm stuck, like tantruming. I really have to laugh at myself sometimes. And by the way, I am indeed a shadow work coach. If you're looking for one that is just not through with the shadow work, apparently. Anyway, so our perceptual experience, how we interact with the world, and how the world is filtered through our lens of interpretation, is the crux of elevating the awareness of what is going on inside and the self-control. And so first, the perceptual awareness has to be laid down, almost like a framework. And what I mean by that is, if you are just going about your day, just reacting like a lot of people do, and there's no shame in it, right? We have to have baseline functions that run in the background. This is efficiency. But at some point, we realize that some of those installations of those programs that are running on our behalf are really not serving our highest good. And so what happens is that we have these knee-jerk reactions and we don't really understand it. And we co-create in our world, sometimes with toxicity. Even though we don't intend on it, very often we feel victimized. And so then we lash out at other people. And where it goes wrong is when nobody was trying to victimize us. And this can be really embarrassing when that happens. And the worst part is when people are actually just trying to love you. That whole saying, don't bite the hand that feeds you. Well, what happens is that when you have a perceptual issue, you don't see that somebody's loving you and helping you and trying to feed you. And so, like my little one, I'm trying to keep her warm and put a blanket over her for her comfort, for her temperature comfort. She perceives it in an entirely different way. And in my client work, what I actually try to do, what I aim to do, is to trigger people as quickly as possible, but not so much that they can't handle it, but to reveal their negative emotional state to themselves. And then we work through it together. This is what makes it so valuable, because we get to work as soon as possible. In the first week, if possible, but usually, depending on the person, it's usually by like week 3 that the triggers come up. But even for some, it's even longer. But highly reactive people that need a lot of shadow work, that have a lot of negative patterns in their life that they know that they're bringing to the table, they love and hate working with me, because nothing goes unexamined. And it can be very uncomfortable, but it's extremely productive if you have that insight. And so that's why that first level is installing a program of awareness. I call it a seat of awareness, because inside it's almost like if you imagine that you, the essence of you, your consciousness, your awareness, usually is centered around your eyes, right? That's most people's. It's like behind the eyes, maybe a little bit above. And that's how you're like seated into your avatar, so to speak. And you function primarily through your eyes, because your eyes are your most dominant sense, unless you're blind. And so as a result, this is where you are present. What you need to do is you actually need to put another little seat of awareness that is kind of like tagging alongside. It's an expansion of the seat that you already have, but it's one that now you're looking inside, you're not just looking out. Most people, when they're unconscious, are just looking out, and there's no awareness inside. And this is part of upgrading your cognition. You need to understand what's going on inside. And if you don't, then you're just a ball and chain of reactions. and I would argue an NPC. And this is what NPCs are. there's no internal awareness inside. So the very first thing that you want to do is to make sure that you have the ability to self-reflect, to ruminate, sometimes by looking outside first. This is why I say it's easier to look outside before we look in, because there's a lot of defensive wounds in the ego. This is just psychology 101. There's a lot of defensive wounds that prevent us from actually looking too deeply at ourselves at the early parts of the self-mastery journey. And so as a result, this is why people say that the world is a mirror, because you learn about yourself by judging other people, criticizing other people, and observing other people's baggage. Because what you see at first is often a reflective process of what you know. And when you're completely unconscious, that is most often mapped. It's not a one-to-one correlation. And this is my controversial take versus other people out in the world. It's not a one-to-one. But most of the time, I believe that it follows like an 80-20 rule. 80% of the time, what you observe in other people is what you have in yourself and is part of your shadow work journey, or is some complement of it. And so as a result, you can then take your perceptual experience of the outside world and you can start to detective, like a detective, you can figure out your internal puzzle by understanding how you are perceiving things. And so, for example, my little one apparently has a perceptual wound that came from birth, because I don't know where it came from. She doesn't have enough experience of being trapped. And so as a result, she takes a neutral, what should be a neutral or comforting stimulus, and she maps on a projection that she fights with. And if you understand how clever the mind is, you'll know that we all do this. This is what Carl Jung was talking about, and even Freud, about the projections of our minds and how we take a positive or neutral thing that happens to us and we warp it. And we do so for some weird reason. It could come from a past life. It could come from early childhood. It could come from a variety of things. But what's interesting is that we all seem to have a projection system in our minds that does this. And that directly controls how we perceive everything, which then, guess what? Controls how we behave. And then guess what? Controls how reality unfolds for us, how we create reality. In the absence of trauma, this still is a mechanism that appears to be functioning. And this is one of my biggest complaints that I have about the collective conscious and the trauma society, is that we're always looking for who to blame. And we're always looking for the witch hunt. And that's okay. There's merit in that, because then we have a sense of justice being done when we can hold people accountable. But I have come to believe that in many cases, I don't want to say all, in many cases, there is nobody to blame. The blanket is not to blame. My intention is not to trap my little one, even though she perceives it that way. She doesn't necessarily perceive me trying to trap her. She just perceives that she's being trapped and stuck. And that creates this fighting response in her, which is interesting to see how that's going to play out as she gets older. And there's no trauma around being stuck. She's never been stuck in her life, and the little bit that unless you consider the womb, she has no experience being stuck that would map on cleanly to why she's behaving in this way, indicating to me that she has an innate function in her projection system, her baseline personality, and her reality creation machinery and her psyche that's not trauma-based. Many of us experience trauma because we perceive it that way. And what's interesting, and this is another very, very unpopular opinion, is that when we look very closely under the hood, sometimes what we find, and again, not all the time, but sometimes what we find is that we mapped on a trauma response unfairly. Like when you think about your parents and you think about where they were at a certain point in their life and consciousness and emotional development, and you think about the generations that came before, and you think about social behavior and what was normal. It used to be quite normal that punishments for children were extreme. And nobody was trying to do their children significant harm. It's just that was the mindset at the time. I read this really interesting fact that they used to punish infants for crying because they thought that at that time the infants were being manipulative because that was their perceptual experience that they were mapping onto. And we're talking like babies below 6 months who were crying to have their needs met. Now we know differently, right? But where humanity was at that time was that they didn't understand children. They didn't understand infants. In fact, there are documents of medical advice advising mothers to wean their children as quickly as possible. As quickly as possible. Now we know differently. And we understand, because science has told us, we understand the needs of a little human better than before. But as a result, when we have these perceptual experiences, we create reality and we end up creating trauma, even though there wasn't intending to be trauma necessarily. It was just that's how you handled things. That's what you did. Compassionate psychology helps us understand that everybody is growing, even collectively. We are all growing. And when we look back at the future generations, we see that they had a lot of growth to do. And future generations are going to look back at us and say the same thing. And we might even be a little embarrassed if we somehow back up our consciousness and port ourselves into the future and are able to look backwards and to see our social structures and our level of understanding about all sorts of things that I don't want to get off on a tangent because I have to wrap this up soon. So by understanding your perceptual experience, where things come from, where trauma is inserted, perhaps unfairly. Obviously, if you were raised by a villain, or if you are drawn to villains, then you can make a case that intentional trauma was definitely part of the agenda. That's why I don't want to say it's all or none. But when you see things from a higher vantage point, you see things differently. And then you interpret reality differently and you behave differently. And the second part of that is Being able to respond differently requires being able to understand how you're seeing things. And to reach that higher level understanding, and it actually rewires the brain to have different responses to stimuli. And that is how you change your behavioral output, which is how you shift your reality. And you create different outcomes, and you break cycles, and you break chains and bonds of suffering that have held you in place for a long time.